organization. Oh, sorry. We are a progressive pro-choice charitable organization committed to advancing and upholding sexual and reproductive health and rights in Canada and globally. And there are 4 core issues that we tend to work on. So those are abortion access, contraception access, comprehensive sexuality education, and advocacy and coalition building. Just acknowledging that within the realm of sexual and reproductive health and rights, there is such a vast variety that there is no way we can work on everything. So part of our mandate is to support organizations who do complementary work to us. And one of the reasons that comprehensive sex ed is such a huge principle for our work is because, as Kate mentioned, the title of this panel, it is one of the most pressing issues in Canadian children's rights at the moment, and young people need access to quality, comprehensive sexuality education. So we know quality sex ed promotes consent, it reduces STIs, it creates LGBTQ plus visibility and inclusion, and generally it makes young people safer and healthier. Currently, the quality of sex ed young people receive in Canada varies wildly province to province. Provinces have different sex ed curricula, which have all been updated at various times. As Hala mentioned, I'm calling in from Toronto. So for example, the Toronto curriculum was updated in 2015 when a new premier came in. That was rolled back, and there have been only mild updates since then, and it's still one of the better sex ed curriculums in the country. There are certainly provinces that do worse. Educators receive little to no support to develop their ability to offer accurate, non-stigmatizing, fulsome sex ed to their students, and a lot of community-based sex health educators are the ones that need to fill the gap, and they're already stretched beyond capacity, offering support where they can. If lessons take place, what is taught is often overlooks the needs and experiences of many of the students, including those who are LGBTQI2S+, as well as the current realities in which young people navigate sexual decision-making today. In sum, the sex ed most young people in Canada receive is not meeting international standards and best practices, nor is it meeting our own 2019 Canadian guidelines for sexuality education, which were put out by CCAN, and they have been supported by the federal government. They're outdated, it's not comprehensive, it's not monitored or evaluated to ensure high quality delivery, and it's offered by educators who receive, as I mentioned, low to no support from provinces, and their comfort levels in engaging with comprehensive sexuality education is often low. So often the sex ed that students can receive will vary based on how comfortable their teachers are in talking about it. Some provinces will allow external parties to come in and teach, and in some cases where educators are not properly supported, or external parties are brought in to teach sex ed, young people are receiving ideologically driven abstinence-based sex ed that is misleading and inaccurate. And particularly in 2022, we know at this point that abstinence-only sex ed does not work. Existing inequalities in sex ed curriculum were only exacerbated when we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly due to school disruptions since March 2020. And over the last 2 years, students and educators have had to adapt to constantly evolving public health instructions, including restrictions on external visitors, long periods of school closures with students learning online, often with little to no privacy at home, staff shortages due to sickness, student absenteeism, and overall mounting pressure on school systems that are already stretched beyond their limits, leading to gaps in young people's knowledge of sexual and reproductive health. Community-based sexual health centers that have been working really hard to fill the gaps to provide youth with integral services and information in a safe space were also forced to close during the pandemic, and due to shortages of staff and resources as demands rose. And due to the pandemic, they were either forced to close their doors or to restrict services, and sometimes labs that were testing for STIs were repurposed to test for COVID-19. And that has led to devastating impacts, and we've seen a rise in the need for sexual health centers in the wake of the pandemic as well. For example, Action Canada runs an access line in which we provide support to SRHR services. And we've seen such a drastic increase that the budget we usually set aside for a year for the access line, we've run through in 4 months. The federal government has repeatedly shirked responsibility for implementing its human rights obligations concerning comprehensive sex ed. And it usually states the division of power between federal and provincial jurisdictions as reasons for refusing to take a leadership role. And governments are required to uphold all people's right to health, well-being, and equality. And that requires the delivery of unbiased, scientifically accurate sex ed. When we say sex ed saves lives, it's not an exaggeration. Comprehensive, well-delivered sex ed helps address and prevent the root causes of negative health outcomes. It changes lives in tangible and important ways. It gives people the right information to take better care of themselves and their bodies. And that means fewer STIs that can have lifelong complications, fewer unplanned pregnancies, a decline in reproductive coercion rates, preventing intimate partner violence and sexual violence, preventing cervical and anal cancers, or catching them earlier, and less sexual health-related issues caused by ignoring symptoms because of shame and fear. So ways Action Canada has tried to work around this division of power really between the federal and the provincial government has been advocating the delivery of comprehensive sex ed in Canada, including advocating for the implementation of the 2019 CCAN guidelines across all provinces, and calling on the federal government to create a national action plan on comprehensive sex ed, advocating with international organizations to call on the federal government to take responsibility for implementing comprehensive sex ed on a national level, including at Canada's review in front of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was one of the first projects I worked on when I joined Action Canada. And it's in its most recent review earlier this year, the Committee on the Rights of the Child did call on Canada to strengthen sexual and reproductive health programs and services to all adolescents, paying particular attention to prevention of unwanted pregnancies, and provide support to pregnant girls and adolescent parents, and to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted infections, and to take immediate measures to ensure equal access to evidence-based comprehensive sexuality education across provinces and territories in line with national guidelines for sexual health education and international human rights obligations. Those sound really general when reading them out loud, but that also means that Canada will now be required to report to the committee during its next review and in each subsequent review on what actions it's taken to implement those recommendations. So these are also tools that we then use to take to the federal government to get them to take action on comprehensive sex ed, because this division of power hasn't been working, and allowing provinces to set their own curricula without even providing a standard really puts youth at risk by not providing them comprehensive sexuality education. So that's all I had covered, but I'm happy to answer any questions that might come up. But this is something that we really are passionate about and we continue to work towards.
Thank you, Nsia. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak at different events, including in front of the Committee on the Rights of the Child as well. And this is a really important topic. I know that I recall one of the children saying at a meeting, if you do not help provide this for us within the education system, we are using the internet. And how dangerous is it for us to learn about these issues on the internet? So, and they did not have a response for her when she stated that. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Athaban Surikant Farja, and I'm sure I'm saying that name again wrong, and I asked you how to say it, but is an Elam Tamil researcher, facilitator, and writer with a focus on social and economic policy, community engagement, and governance. He is currently a project coordinator at Family Service Toronto with Campaign 2000, a national coalition working to end child and family poverty, where he coordinates a community-based research project engaging with living expertise of poverty on the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Welcome, Athaban. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hala. And thanks so much to INSEAD. That was a really great presentation, and I think also leads really well into into the one I'm about to give, just thinking about Canada's human rights obligations and the ones that they've continued to shirk. I'm just going to put my slides up really quickly, so everyone bear with me in that awkward minute of let's watch me put my slides up. Great. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah, looks
Yep.
good.
Great. Yeah, so as Hala mentioned, my name
Can
is...
can you turn your volume up a little bit, please?
Oh, sure. Maybe I can move a little closer. Is that better?
Yeah, or change your settings so we can hear you better. The other volume seemed to be okay. It just yours was a little low.
Okay, good to know. I'll just try to speak a bit louder, and hopefully that gets us closer. So my name is Adhavan. I'm the project coordinator with Campaign 2000. I'm calling in from Treaty 13 territory as well. And I think it is important to acknowledge the land and the Indigenous presence on this land, as I'm about to talk a bit about Indigenous child and family poverty as well, and that kind of ongoing violence that Indigenous communities experience. It's also good to see a number of Campaign 2000 members in the room, so hello to all of you. Campaign 2000 is a national coalition of over 120 organizations working to end child and family poverty. We were founded after the 1989 all-party federal resolution to end child and family poverty by the year 2000, and since then we've been working to track and monitor federal progress towards ending poverty, and that 2000 commitment has come and gone, and we've continued to advocate and put forward evidence-based policy recommendations to address this problem. So I'll start off with a bit of thinking about what is poverty, and Campaign 2000 approaches poverty in a few different ways. We first think about it as not being inevitable. It's a social construct and an idea that we as a society have created, but it doesn't actually have to exist, especially in a country as wealthy as Canada. And it's also important to frame poverty as a violation of our fundamental human rights. And we know the human rights framework lays out the case for this through the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, through the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, all of which are underpinned by human rights, and which we know Canada is a signatory of and has made commitments to, but it has not followed through on their obligations in meaningful ways. Before I kind of dive into kind of the picture of poverty in Canada, I want to talk a little bit about some definitions and measurements and how we define those measurements. The official poverty line in Canada is the market basket measure. It's how the federal government tracks its progress towards ending poverty, and what it is a measure of material deprivation. Just really seeing how if someone can meet their basic needs with their disposable income. And Campaign 2000 recognizes the kind of flaws in that measure, and instead uses a measure called the low income measure. It's an international standard that's used, and what it is a relative measure of poverty. It looks at an individual and how they're faring in relation to the rest of society. Do they have access to the basic needs, but also the same kinds of opportunities as the rest of people in society? And so what it really tries to look at it is frame it from that perspective of inequality. And the difference between these two measures is significant. You'll see on this graph, it shows over time the child poverty rate using the market basket measure in the red line below, and then the low income measure in the blue line above. And you'll see there's a significant gap in what these two pictures are telling us. With the MBM, we're seeing 1 in 10 children in poverty, or 680,000, whereas with the LIM, we're seeing about 1.3 million children, or about 1 in 5 children. So you'll see that there's this there's this gap that's happening where child poverty is being invisibilized, where we're missing a portion of the picture. I will say before I go forward, the data I'll be showing you throughout this presentation is from 2019 census and tax filer data. That's what we use for our report card in 2021, but we're in the process right now of updating that data based on the 2020 census and other and recent tax filer data. And I'll unpack what that means. So there's a few discrepancies there. This is a map of child poverty in Canada, and you'll see here that in the dark blue, you're seeing provinces or territories where it's above the national rate, and in the light blue, it's below the national rate. We've seen some significant reductions in poverty, and as well as also some significant increases. I'll say now that the province with the highest rate of child poverty is Manitoba, with 28.4%, and then the territory with the highest rate of child poverty is Nunavut with 34.4%. This graph just shows us the percentage change in the provinces and territories. You'll see that Nunavut had a significant increase in child and family poverty, whereas PEI saw the greatest decrease. But throughout the middle, kind of this sense of stagnation. And you'll see this a bit more about this stagnation in this graph. This shows over time child poverty rates, and you'll see at the beginning in 2000 when that federal commitment was made towards, child poverty rates were actually peaking in this country. And since then, we've seen a steady decline, but that progress has really been stalling. I'd like to pinpoint kind of two pieces. One is around the 2015 time, you'll see the most significant drop in the rates of child poverty, and that was as a result of the Canada Child Benefit. And it just shows us the impact of government transfers putting money in the hands of families to provide for themselves and their children, and the impact that that's having. But since then, we've seen kind of this steady kind of stalling of changes to the child poverty rate because of the lack of further investment into the Canada Child Benefit. And then I'll also note that this goes up to 2019. We know that the data will look quite different for 2020, and that's because of the large number of government transfers that came as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw the number of pandemic benefits as well as top-ups to other benefits. So we know that the rates of child poverty will go down as a result of that. But through our kind of further research, we've been kind of talking to low-income folks across the country, and we've been hearing that with inflation, the high rates of food inflation, and the fact that all of those pandemic measures were temporary and have since ended, we're expecting to see a stark increase in poverty in 2021 and beyond. This graph, I'll just go through it quickly, looks at the impact of government transfers. You'll see it for under 6 in red and under 18 in the blue color. We know that child poverty rates are often higher for children under 6. So that first set of bars looks at child poverty rates without government transfers. The second one looks at, the first one looks at with government transfers. The second one looks at child poverty rates without government transfers. And the third one looks at child poverty rates without the Canada Child Benefit. So it just shows the kind of real impact that government transfers, especially ones like the Canada Child Benefit, have in addressing poverty. We know that through this data, we know that children are also living in deeper poverty. So this graph looks at the depth of poverty. So on average, by family type, how far away are families from closing the gap between their income and the poverty line? And I'd like to highlight that for a single mother with 2 children, that gap is about $13,262, and that's about 5.5 months of continued minimum wage work to make up that gap. So people and families are living in deeper poverty. This graph looks at child poverty rates by Indigenous identity, immigration status, and racialized identity. And what it shows, and I'll go through the numbers because I think they're important, the disparity in experiences of folks. So status First Nation children on reserve experience a child poverty rate of about 53%. So that's exactly just over 1 in 2 children. Status rate First Nations off reserve experience a child poverty rate of 41%. Recent immigrant is 35%, non-status First Nation is 32%, Inuit is 25%, and then for racialized folks and for Métis folks, it's 22% respectively. And you'll see the non-racialized, non-immigrant, non-Indigenous group, or essentially white folks, experience the lowest child and family poverty rate, about 12%. And it's important to put this slide up there because this kind of shows us the continued impact of living in under colonized systems, and the legacy of the kinds of violence that have been experienced in this country continue to today to keep folks in poverty. So it's important to kind of highlight and center that as we continue, that this work cannot happen without the dismantling of some of those systems. Just to kind of further on this point, this is child poverty rate by select racialized groups. It's just to show that racialized groups are not homogenous, and a number of groups experience it differently. And again, it's that kind of it's the systemic racism that's perpetuating these rates of child poverty. This graph shows us income inequality, and we know that income inequality is widening. If you look at the highest decile, that's the top 10% of families, their incomes make up about 25% of all incomes across this graph. And the top 10% of families make up, on average, about $230,000 a year, while that lowest 10% make about $14,000 a year. So that you can see how wide the gap is, and how we know through some of the research that it is widening as we speak. So I want to speak a little bit, as I kind of close off, just about this idea of the best interest of the child. I know that was one of the focuses that you folks are looking at. And so we've been working closely with the Child Welfare League of Canada. They're one of the founding members of Campaign 2000. And I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the pieces of their work that kind of subvert our understanding of the best interest of the child, and whose responsibility that is to see that come to light. When we think of the best interest of the child as the responsibility of a family, or responsibility of someone to provide the basic needs of that child and ensure their emotional well-being and their development, those responsibilities are often placed on the families, where when we think about it, the society creates the conditions for those families to be unable to provide those basic needs as a result of a lack of investment, a lack of support towards families to ensure that they have the resources they need to provide that best interest to the child. So just really interrogating that idea of neglect. And we know that the role of the child welfare system in this, child apprehensions and the removal of children from families causes extensive trauma and disruption to the families. It often furthers that family's experience of poverty, and kind of lengthens the time it takes for them to get out of that situation. And we know that the child welfare system has disproportionately targeted Indigenous and Black families, and continues kind of that legacy of colonialism. And we know that, in ensuring the best interest of the child, both the federal government as well as the provinces and territories have a role to play in fulfilling those obligations. And to give an example of this, our partners in Nova Scotia are working on some of the changes to the Child and Family Services Act, which have kind of expanded the definition of neglect, but again, kind of punitively placed them on marginalized families, especially to provide those needs, whereas the province has a role to play in ensuring that those families have what they need to provide basic needs, such as shelter, clothing, food, adequate supervision, things like that. And this quote, I think, frames it very nicely. Being poor does not make someone a poor parent, though poverty can create conditions under which maltreatment is more likely to occur. Similarly, addressing economic risk and poverty is necessary, but not sufficient to end child maltreatment or the need for child protective services. So I just wanted to frame that a bit as you folks to kind of take on that work of the best interest of the child, and as you start to think about some of those pieces. I'll close off just kind of with some of the areas that Campaign 2000 works on. We put forward a number of recommendations towards addressing child poverty, and they kind of fall into this series of buckets. Ending inequality. We do a lot of work on the tax system, as well as government transfers, the important role of decent work, adequate, accessible public services and public health, which is incredibly important in the wake of this pandemic. So that was all I had. I'm happy to take any questions at the end. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Athavan, for this essential overview and for addressing, the impact of poverty and just unpacking that, because, we appreciate that you began with what is poverty, because I think a lot of people don't really, when I speak to students as well and ask that question, they're not sure how to address it, and they don't think of, children in Canada living in poverty. It's always a concept that they think is for other children. So thank you for unpacking that. Really appreciate it. Our next presenter is Dave Meslin, who's based in Toronto, and he co-founded Spacing Magazine and then created the Who Runs This Town project in 2006. Later, he founded the Toronto Cyclists Union, as well as started another magazine, Dandy Horse Magazine. Recent projects include curating the Fourth Wall exhibit, which reflects on issues of local politics in Toronto. Meslin is currently a community organizer promoting his thoughts on political change, cycling reform, and public space issues through his blog. He has written a book called Local Motion, The Art of Civic Engagement in Toronto. As an active member of the political community in Toronto, the speeches by Dave Meslin spark passionate dialogue about changing social norms and becoming more action-focused as members of a thriving city. Welcome, Dave, and Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Hala. That bio was 10 years old, which is my fault. I'm sure Kate has been emailing me being like, send me a bio. I don't live in Toronto anymore. I live in Eugenia, Ontario, in Grey County. And I have a much better book out than Local Motion. It's called Tear Down. And it's all these different ways to improve our democracy, instead of democracy being like really polarized and hostile and toxic and top down, centralized power, alienating from most ordinary people, very white male straight dominated, often along hereditary white male straight lineage, and of course a voting system that often gives us very distorted results, including the Ontario government right now, which wasn't elected by a majority of voters yet is doing some really major things. Anyway, so nice to be here. Nice to see some familiar faces. Hi, Noah. I'm currently in Wyerton, the home of Wyerton Willie. And it is the territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, and Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation, and more recently, Wyerton Willie. I'm going to talk a bit about the campaign to lower the voting age to 16. I'm the national campaign director for this. It's a really exciting campaign. We have a website at vote16.ca. By the way, I am in a hospital room. If anyone's wondering if this looks like a hospital room, I'm visiting my partner who's going to be fine, but she's in the hospital right now. She's having lunch while I'm Zooming from her hospital bed. These are decorations that a friend gave to her, these beautiful cats. Vote16.ca is a national campaign targeting national reform, provincial reform, territorial, but also municipal. Because if you look at the history of a lot of democratic reforms, they actually start at the hyper-local level. So for example, you can Google, when did women get the right to vote in Canada? It'll give you the national date, probably. But if you look 5 years before that, that right had already been granted in a whole bunch of provinces, mostly in Western Canada. But you go 10 years before that, and women activist groups had already secured the right to vote municipally in dozens of cities across Canada. So I think it's really important when it comes to any type of democratic reform to not focus on what's going on in Ottawa and what's Doug Ford doing, but really focus on the almost 4,000 city halls across Canada. I think it's the most fertile opportunity for any kind of reform, even though it's less sexy and it won't end up in the history books. That's actually where the seeds get planted. It also creates a great opportunity for volunteers. So if I'm recruiting young volunteers, for example, one of the nurses came in today and said her 15-year-old daughter would love to get involved with Vote 16. So for her to get involved with the national campaign, all I can say is, well, phone your MP. That's not really fun, nor, to be honest, is it effective, because every MP's vote is completely whipped. They have no actual independent voice in Canada. But what's way more exciting is for me to tell her daughter, I think the daughter's name is Marianne, well, why don't you start up Vote 16 Wyerton? You're in charge. You're the campaign manager. I'll help you with every step of the way to advocate to your local councillors. And in Ontario, there's no whipped votes on council. There shouldn't be, maybe by lobbyists, and your mayor, and do what you can to get the voting age lowered municipally. Way more fun. Okay, anyways, some of you might be wondering, why the heck would we want to lower the voting age to 16? 16-year-olds are not ready. They're immature. Their science has proven that their brains have not fully formed. In fact, they're not fully formed until 25. They're all watching TikTok. They're all doing drugs. And if they're not doing drugs, they're eating Tide Pods. And it would be the end of civilization as we know it. Thank you, Robin. If we lowered the voting age. So all those ideas are out there. I hear them all the time. Let me begin by saying that any voting age that we set is arbitrary. There is no magical age where we all suddenly become adults. And in fact, I have not fully become an adult myself yet. I'll bet Noah hasn't either. And I'm 48 years old. So anything we pick is arbitrary. When we pick an age for anything, when can you offer consent for sex? When can you decide to leave home? When can you make decisions about, medical surgeries, etc.? When can you drive? When can you drink? When can you smoke? We have to set these numbers, and they're all ridiculous. There is no age where suddenly we're all ready to make a decision. When we set those numbers, and they should be different for all of these things, I would actually move driving up a little bit and bring voting down a little bit. For each one, you have to look at the specific task and then weigh the pros and the cons. What could we gain as a society by having the age higher or lower? And what are the risks of having it higher or lower? So when you talk about something like driving, you probably want to err on the side of having it a bit higher, because the risks to society are enormous. Statistically, teens don't drive very well. And from my own experience, I was a really dangerous driver as a teen. I thought it was kind of like a video game. It was like I had been playing pole position for years in arcades where you put a quarter in the big machine and you drive. And I was like, oh my God, now I can do this in a real car. The risks there are very dangerous. In fact, my girlfriend is in the hospital because she was hit by a car by a young person in their 20s who was intoxicated, and she has all these broken bones and she's walking again, but it took her 3 months to learn how to walk again. So driving is serious. Drinking is serious. Sexual consent, of course, is serious, although the harm is to the individual, not society necessarily. So I think maybe we err a little bit lower then. If you want to make a decision that might hurt yourself, I think we should be empowered to make those decisions at a lower age than decisions that could hurt someone else. Voting to me is the easiest one. Let's say worst case scenario, all 16 and 17-year-olds are just complete idiots. Okay, so what? Like, what's the risk? We lower the voting age and what? They might all vote for someone as stupid and moronic as Donald Trump. I mean, really, we couldn't lower the bar very much in terms of the quality of people who are already reaching the highest levels of office in the world. So this idea that right now it's all these like really thoughtful, informed adults who read through all the party platforms and sit down with their families and talk about who they're going to vote for. But if we lowered the voting age, now we'd be diluting that with these uninformed, immature people. It's just it's so ridiculous. It's offensive. It's grotesquely inaccurate. If you want to talk about immaturity, again, I would point to someone like Donald Trump. I would point to someone like Rob Ford, where like it's almost a point of pride that I'm going to bring this kind of like immaturity to the office. So we're there already. If you're worried about bringing immaturity into politics, you haven't been paying attention. But I'm going to tell you two really important reasons. Again, I just wanted to put that aside. Worst case scenario, what's the fear? But now let me talk about reasons why we should do it. Two reasons. When it comes to the science behind brain formation, there is a distinction between cold cognition and hot cognition. Hot cognition is decisions you make in the moment, spontaneous, influenced by peer pressure, and you might make a right or wrong decision that could have consequences. Again, should I have another beer? Should I get in the car? Should I take that pill? Teen brains are not fully formed for that type of spontaneous hot cognition, which is why I myself was a bad driver. Cold cognition is very different. It's when you're given a bunch of information, like teens do in their classes every day, where they're learning about science and history and whatever, or when they're talking to their friends. You're given information, you have time to think about the information, process the information, and then come to your own conclusion based on that information. The 16-year-old brain is completely formed and has the same capacities as any of us do, maybe even better for cold cognition. But let me even put that aside. Even if there was no reason to prove that 16-year-olds were as capable as 18 or 40 or 50-year-olds, there's still one reason why we should absolutely lower the voting age as soon as possible. And it has to do with developing a positive habit of being an active voter at the age which is most conducive towards actually voting. Data suggests that if you don't vote in your first election, you've already set yourself on a path of being a non-voter. You've now created essentially a habit, a trend. So when the next election comes around, you're like, oh, I didn't vote last time, I guess I won't vote this time. And that just carries on through life. And in fact, as we know, in Ontario, for example, we had the record low level of turnout this spring, and Toronto just last week had the record low turnout for municipal elections. So this is a crisis. How do we fix it? One way to fix it is to ensure that people are creating healthy, positive habits of electoral participation. So let's compare the lifestyle circumstances of an 18-year-old to a 16-year-old. And keep in mind, when the voting age is 18, it's actually 18, 19, 20, and 21, because we're on roughly a 4-year election cycle. There's only a 25% chance that you're actually going to vote at 18, which means when we lower it to 16, we're now talking 16, 17, 18, 19. So if you're still in high school and you're allowed to vote, number one, you're going to be on the voters list. You live in the area. The voting station is a block away from your house at the library or the school. Your parents can go vote with you together as a family, which is amazing because there's actually evidence to suggest if you lower the voting age, it increases the likelihood that your parents will vote because they'll be embarrassed that they're not going. Your civics teacher suddenly has a much easier job because they're not teaching you about this abstract thing that you'll be able to do when we feel you're ready, little child, but instead we're teaching you about a responsibility that you are ready to do now, which makes civics way more relevant and engaging. Let's compare that now. And I would say the likelihood of someone voting in that context is like, let's say 60%, 65%. I'm just pulling that out of the air. Now let's shift that 3 years later, 18, 19, 20. You're at university. Very strong likelihood you're in a different town or you're at college. Very strong likelihood you're not living at home. You're definitely not on the voters list. You're in a riding you've never heard of. You don't really care about it. You know you're not going to be there 5 years later. You're definitely not walking to the library with your mom or your dad. You're not in civics class. You're being faced with a lot of social challenges around alcohol and drugs, dating, which is a nightmare and very distracting, and the weight of your academic life. The chance of you finding out where to vote, taking your voting card, putting yourself in the voting list, going to some library or school you've never heard of, and then voting for a candidate who's going to represent a riding that you don't care about, you've now gone from 65% chance of voting to, I'd say, zero, just zero. So just for that alone, I'm such a huge fan of lowering the voting age. So I haven't been looking at the chat. There might be some questions. I'll try and answer them, but if you go to vote16.ca, and you should go check it out right now, there's two particular things I want to direct your attention to. The top right corner of the page is join the movement. That just means subscribe to the newsletter. I highly encourage you to click on that and sign up for the newsletter. But also at the bottom of that first page is a map of Canada. You can click on any province, territory, or municipality, and it'll tell you if we have an active campaign there. You can join the local campaign, or if you want, you could partner with the campaign. So if you're part of a nonprofit or an organization or an academic institution, we'd love to add your endorsement or to connect you with those local groups. And if you'd like to help start a new initiative in your province, in your territory, in your municipality, please let me know. It's a very decentralized campaign, and we don't know where the first victory will be. It could be New Brunswick, could be BC, it could be Sudbury, it could be Fredericton. We just don't know. So we want to push everywhere. And I'll say one more thing. This is the kind of change that up until it happens, it seems radical, it seems crazy. When I was growing up, the probability of gay marriage or legalizing pot seemed like no way, not in my lifetime. Now that it's happened, it's just the most normal thing. No one's campaigning against it. No one's saying, let's take away gay marriage, right? I think Vote 16 is going to be the same thing. There's a lot of pushback right now. People think it's dangerous and crazy. It's going to happen. It's going to happen in the next 10 years. It's happening all over the world. There's going to be pioneers who push it forward, and there's going to be dinosaurs who slow us down. But this is coming, and I invite all of you to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that. Couldn't agree more. It's definitely an important issue, and hopefully there will be change. There are a lot of questions for all the panelists, and I'm just keeping track of time. We have about 11 minutes. So Kate, do you want to start with the questions in the chat?
Sure, there's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to start and we'll see what we can do here. So Insia, the first question is for you. So how can we hold provinces accountable for comprehensive sex ed directly?
So one of the big things is there needs to be a national standard for things that provinces need to be teaching as a mandatory before we can go more into detail. There's so much that isn't included in the curriculums, such as family planning, that we can't even get to because we're not at a baseline with a lot of provinces. There are provinces that don't even teach consent yet. So to be able to hold provinces account, the federal government needs to set a standard of this is what you have to teach. And once they don't teach that, then we can go back to the provinces and say, hey, you have to teach at least the bare minimum, and you're not even doing that. Currently, that's entirely left up to the provinces to decide what their curriculum looks like.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Insia. And the second question is, could also, let me see, I'm trying to see the questions that Kate just sent me. So there's a question for you, Athavan, and it is school programs, including on nutrition, could also go such a long way in reducing the impact of poverty on children. I know that the child poverty rate in Quebec is significantly lower. What can we learn from this? School programs, including nutrition, reduce impact of poverty, child care, the poverty reduction strategy committed to multidimensional targets to reduce poverty. Have targets in general worked, and have they used other targets as well as income?
Okay. Happy to answer those. There's a few questions in there.
Yeah, I know.
I'll try my best. I would say on the nutrition piece, for sure, nutrition programs are important for addressing food insecurity for children. I will say, though, in addition to those, there needs to be an income solution to food insecurity. We recently worked on a submission with Proof, which is a food insecurity network, and one of the big pieces we've highlighted is that addressing food insecurity will always be an income problem, and so ensuring that families have adequate incomes to provide the food supports and resources they need to their children is probably the first step on food insecurity. So nutrition programs are great and a good policy solution, but in addition to that, we need to be thinking about, food insecurity as an income problem. I heard a question in there about the poverty reduction strategy. Yes, I think the poverty reduction strategy had kind of two main, very unambiguous targets, and then the final one of which was reduce poverty by 50% by 2030. We put forward kind of a number of recommendations around the poverty reduction strategy, which you can find in our 2021 report card. But at a high level, I'll say, with the pandemic benefits, the federal government has kind of gone and surpassed that 50% by 2030 mark. And we know that doesn't paint an accurate picture, but what we would say is for the federal government to put forward even more ambitious targets towards ending poverty, and ensure those targets are based on the fundamental kind of understanding of human rights and an adequate standard of living. So to both have that be a part of the poverty reduction strategy, but then also to be kind of amended into the Poverty Reduction Act. The other piece that I will say is that, although the strategy is great, there is no true real action plan towards how the federal government will invest into programs that will address poverty. And so I think the other piece that we're looking at in terms of the poverty reduction strategy is a more actionable outline of what are those steps and what are the budget allocations that will push us towards those targets. Can you repeat the part about childcare? Sorry, there was a few questions.
Yes, I know there were a lot under each other. So the childcare one was, here we go. Their school programs, including nutrition, reduce impact of poverty. And then it just says under it childcare. So there wasn't like a question. I think that was the question that was underneath it. I don't know who asked that question. My apologies if you are on screen, because please do correct me if I'm missing a part of the question.
I'm happy to just quickly talk in terms of childcare. I think there has been a lot of amazing movement on this piece of work, as many of you have probably been following. I think from Campaign 2000's perspective, we called for not just not just a $10 a day childcare program, but also a sliding scale $0 to $10 a day childcare program for especially low-income families who are experiencing different kinds of marginalization, so that they can access childcare without having it be a strain on their budget. Because $10 a day is great, but those $10 a day mean something for low-income families, and so ensuring that programs are sliding scale and meet families where they're at. We also, call for more investment and funding into the childcare system writ large, because we know those jobs are precarious. The kinds of resources to those centers and to childcare organizations are lacking, and so also investment into childcare programs and organizations to ensure that the quality of care is also adequate.
Thank you very much, Athavan. And last question, Kate, is for Dave.
Yeah, there's been a lot of questions for Dave. He's sort of answered some of them. He just answered the last one about the proxy voting there. So could I just ask, unless there's any other burning questions, I'll ask my question for Dave, which is why is this such a, I guess what I'd say is when we posted this panel on Facebook and Twitter, we had a lot of sort of negative comments. People seem very sort of up in arms about this topic. I'm wondering if you could just talk about why it's such an issue. And Kathy, I think this kind of gets at your question too about sort of this attachment to 18 as a voting age.
I think it's a form of discrimination, and I think it's something we really have to push back on. When people take an entire age group and accuse them all of eating Tide Pods, when actually data shows that more adults drank Lysol because Donald Trump told them to than the amount of teens who allegedly ate Tide Pods and went to hospital, which didn't even happen. I think we should have the same response as we would against sexism or racism or homophobia. It's really inappropriate the way the gut response that some people have, like, oh, 16-year-olds are stupid. It's sad that we live in a culture where that is considered acceptable. And I think that's what it is. I think we really treat both our seniors and our youth with a kind of condescending approach, which makes all of us in the middle of those groups feel smarter and better. And I think part of what we're trying to do with Vote 16 is push back against that. Youth are crazy smart. Like, we all know it. We all learn stuff from our kids. Teachers learn things from their students. It's just, it's really grotesque. That's all.
Thank you, Dave. Definitely. And, you know, it's just one of these things where recent elections, they said the youth vote wasn't out. And we had these discussions with Kate as well, where you're asking for the youth vote, yet you're not helping them prepare for it in advance, and you're not addressing the issues with them. And then, you know, by the time they are able to vote, they're not voting because they're just not prepared to do so, and they're not interested. That's another issue because you haven't enabled that. So thank you very much for that. Any other questions? We have about 2 minutes and can take one final question. I know there are a lot of questions in the chat. I wasn't be able to go through them all. So if anyone really wants to ask their question, please unmute yourself. If not, we have 2 minutes. We're good? Okay.
Yeah, can I go?
Sorry. Yes,
Sorry.
please go for it.
Yeah, sorry, it's Deborah here. I guess one of the things I was thinking about the poverty, I guess I feel a little bit cynical in this age where there's so much inequality. And I just wonder whether, you know, there's too much focus, or the focus on the money. The money aspect is really getting to the crux of what is really causing so much injustice and oppression, you know. I mean, it's great to have the extra money, but I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure that it really covers so much of what poverty is about. But that's all I'll say for now.
No, I'm happy to quickly respond to that. And for sure, I think we think of poverty as this. It is, you know, the first thought you think of is the money, but in reality, it is all aspects of the things that you need to live a dignified and healthy life. You know, through our research, we've been talking to communities across the country about their experiences of poverty at the local level. And what are their visions, you know, for a poverty-free, thriving community? And the things that folks talk about are, you know, having someone to go to after work to, you know, chat about a recipe, or someone who can provide you words of affirmation, or, you know, community agriculture and community-driven agriculture. So I think the visions for what a poverty-free community are broad and go beyond just income. But those things also require investments and policy solutions from governments to invest in ensuring that people have thriving, dignified, and children and young people live in thriving and dignified communities and lives. So totally agree with you. Poverty goes beyond the income piece, but it, you know, requires policy solutions and investment from governments at all levels.
Right. Okay. Thank you.